All right. Well, Justin Farrar, it has been a long time coming in terms of talking to you on the podcast. I always feel, I hope this isn't too much of a compliment, but, you know, I always feel like I've done a good job on making a Nostalgia Trap episode when I see you posting a lot about it and you're responding to it. I'm like, I've done something right because Justin is telling the world about it. But I mean, I would just start by thanking you for your support of the show over the years, but also it's just it's great to talk to you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's nice to meet you beyond Twitter, as we were just talking about.
Right.
I feel like so many relationships now are just for tweets.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's weird. And I'm like sort of like philosophically anti-Twitter. At the same time, I'm like, so some of my most profound exchanges between people I've met online have been around Twitter and this podcast. I wanted to talk to you about music mostly, Justin, because you post a lot about music. Are you a musician yourself?
I am not. I'm just one gigantic music nerd.
And when did that start? Has that always been your life?
It's always been that way. My dad's a singer. My mom was in the arts and is a huge music nerd. And I think it really comes through her lineage. Although I'm into a lot of stuff that my dad's Italian, studied opera. And then he, this is a rabbit hole, but my dad had a lounge band when I was growing up.
Okay.
So I was in nightclubs. My brother had a hair metal band. So I was in rock clubs hanging out when I was too young. And then my mom is my mom's a hipster, very hip. She grew up here in West Michigan, but then bolted for New York in like 63. And she was on the Lower East Side. And in fact, she lived right above one of the like main jazz clubs called Slug Saloon. And that was like where the out players played, like Albert Ayler, Sun Ra would all play this play. In fact, there's several records recorded live at Slug Saloon on that label. I'm not sure if you ever heard of called ESP Disc. And that was like this amazing avant-garde New York label. And they still do stuff, but in the late 60s, they were just releasing just mind-blowing free jazz records. And I get it from her. Like she was actually into the Velvet Underground in the 60s. Like, so she was just very cool.
It's funny to think the connection with you and your mom, like that word hipster is like connected to jazz specifically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I don't think people use that when people say the word hipster now, they don't necessarily think jazz. They think like, I don't know. I'm going to date myself. They're going to think like Modest Mouse or something like that. Like they're going to think like indie rock or some other genre other than jazz.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. And the way I'm kind of using it is kind of a throwback. Although I will admit she didn't listen to a ton of jazz. She was mainly a rock and folky. But yeah, that was her thing. I mean, she just and then they met. She was a dancer. It just gets totally crazy. She was a dancer at the Copacabana. She was a Copa girl.
Wow.
And that's where she met my dad, who was, I think, he's kind of a door guy, but also had a reputation as kind of shady with Italian connections.
I have no idea what you're talking about. That's incredible. I kind of sense it's funny because there are many Nostalgia Trap intersections there, especially, I don't know, the like 60s Italian American connection with my wife Claudia's family, and her father is a musician and composer, really into like classical music and opera and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, the jazz connection is there too. Did you listen to Phil Schaap? Did you hear? Do you know who that guy is? He was like a DJ in New York that was really like he had a show called Bird Flight that I listened to a lot. That was all about Charlie Parker.
Oh, okay.
But he died earlier this year. His stuff was like he was like listening to him was like listening to, one of those jazz gurus that just knows everything and is able to talk about music in ways that are so, I don't know, deep and complex. But I didn't know he died. He died just like, I don't know, last year.
Yeah, that's certainly a bummer. But I love that about jazz is that like when you find a good jazz program, it isn't just the music, it's the DJ.
Yeah, right.
And the DJ brings you into their world. In fact, that's kind of funny we're talking about that because I remember, just a few minutes ago, we were kind of thinking like, let's talk a little about Neil and Spotify.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? Kind of, that radio idea, which I don't know. I mean, it seems like it's still hanging on and still popular in niche circles, but I just love that idea of the DJ with the records, and you're taking a journey with them, and you don't really get that necessarily with that. I think it's maybe why I like podcasting and gotten so into listening, because it's bringing back a little bit of that feel for me.
What's funny is a lot of albums, especially like I've noticed like hip hop albums, especially, but I don't know, rock albums too. Like Queens of the Stone Age did one too, where they do like albums that are kind of mock radio, like listening to radio, and they're sort of like Vince Staples did one a couple years ago called FM that was entirely that. Like it's got all those sounds. We've done a little bit of that nostalgia trap. I love that, like tuning the radio sound and finding different things, and the DJ coming in. I mean, it's funny to me that there are albums that sort of recreate that experience for people, because you and I and a whole generation of people, that was the main place for music for me, was radio or MTV growing up, honestly.
Yeah.
Did you have a lot of like vinyl or like music around that wasn't radio and MTV? Because I didn't really have physical. I wasn't the type of we weren't the type of family that had a lot of physical media around. It was entirely like whatever I could listen to on the radio. And when MTV came, I think that was why it was so vital to me, because it was the only time I listened to music that was like outside at all. Of what you could hear on the radio or what we had in the house, because it's mostly like Rod Stewart and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, my mom had a large, in fact, a real formative experience is my mom just putting on records in her bedroom. Yeah. And I would lay on her bed and just hear the records. Van Morrison's Astro Weeks that really stands out as one. She used to just put that on. And I think she put on, she had the type of turntable that you could just, repeat.
That album, Van Morrison's Astro, that album is just like, I don't know. That is a drug experience unto its own for me. I don't know what it is about that album, that there's a special quality to it. And you know what? It's fun. I'm glad you brought up Van Morrison, because this is exactly where I wanted to start with you, Justin, which was Neil Young. And like, okay, so we're trying to think about like, I think one of the things you and I have talked about on Twitter before is what is the legacy of the 60s psychedelic counterculture, rock and roll, all that stuff, because it was music, but it was also politics, and it was also like a way of looking at the world. But then, like, I don't know, there's been decades have gone by, and a lot of those big figures from the 60s are like, they've gone through decades of life, and you have like, Neil Young right now taking a principled stand against Spotify, while, Van Morrison and Eric Clapton are leading like anti-vaccination rallies and like putting out really awful records that are, I think, anti-vaccination or COVID is fake news records or something like that. My point is, the 60s guys aren't really united anymore. They all went in different directions in terms of their politics. But what do you think of the Neil Young Spotify thing? Because like part of me is like bummed that Neil's not on Spotify, because I listen to it. But on the other hand, I'm like, I have a lot of Neil stuff. Like, I'm a Neil guy. Like, I have a lot of CDs. I have a lot of vinyl. I think I looked. I have some of his stuff I purchased on iTunes years ago, so I'm digging that out of the old hard drives. What do you think of Neil Young's take?
Neil's an impulsive guy. I love how he jumps into the fray. And on this one, I'm glad he's on the right side, because, Neil's batting average isn't, sometimes with politics, he can lose himself in the weeds, in 79, 80, he supported Reagan. And then, right after 9/11, he said some really dumb stuff about like, well, we just might have to, live with the Patriot Act so we can get these bad guys, that kind of thing.
Didn't he do a song called Let's Roll after 9/11 that I remember hearing?
Cheesy.
And yeah, my heart was breaking. But that's part of, like, Neil gets this, he's like this unimpeachable guy for me, in part because he's just so pure to himself, and he'll come out with these weird takes on everything. I mean, I read his memoir. It's entirely, I mean, he talks about capitalism a lot and how proud he is to be an American capitalist, etc. At the same time, he's like, I don't know, an environmentalist and like very concerned with climate change. And there's a lot of contradictions, is what I'm saying, with Neil Young.
There are. And with Spotify, I think it's the Rogan thing. Obviously, that seems to be setting him off. But I also think there's deeper issues. He's an audiophile, and that's come up with some of the articles that are kind of covering this. And so he's always been a little weirded out about the streaming world, and particularly, his big beef with Spotify. I would imagine is that it doesn't sound as good as some of the other streaming services, which is a legitimate concern. So I think there's that. And then, I don't know, there was something there. There was a little train of thought with Neil I had, but, the contradictions. And to go back to that is, those kind of contradictions have always been with those rockers, right? From the 60s, like, it's kind of funny that the legacy thing can plays funny games with nostalgia and memory, because we have this idea that they were all radical. But then you kind of dig into their history and stuff, and it's not such a simple, none of them were ever socialists or communists or anything, I mean, they in fact, a lot of the hippies, a lot of the West Coast hippies specifically, when you see like Buffalo Springfield, the Byrds, they kind of took on a kind of hippie as pioneering idea, right? The buckskin fringe and the cowboy hat, and I mean, he was even living with Daryl Hannah in her tent or teepee at one point a few years ago.
There's the whole Laurel Canyon scene seems like it's kind of doing that Disneyland pioneer thing.
Yeah, the space cowboy, which was such a fundamental component of that world.
There was a little, like, I don't know. It was a picture that went around on social media this week. I don't know if you saw it. It was like Lou Reed as the rock critic. Did you see that thing? And it was like, it was like all these. It was an interview with Lou Reed from the mid '70s, and they were just asking him his opinion on like random stars of the age. What do you think of David Bowie? What do you think of Jerry Garcia? All that sort of thing. And one of the things he said about the California bands, they asked him, like, what do you think about the California bands? And that it was interesting to me that they could just say the California bands and everyone knows what they're talking about. But he was like, Jefferson Airplane, he just hated all of it. He's like, they're a bunch of fucking phonies. They're the most untalented people in the world. They're so pretentious. Like, he hated Jerry Garcia. He hated Frank Zappa. He sort of saw them as like people who were putting on a costume. And the thing he said about Frank Zappa was, this is the kind of guy that hates himself, and I think I agree with him.
Well,
and that's Lou Reed. I mean, the caveat is it's Lou Reed, but
Oh yeah, I mean, I journalists would go to him for the incendiary take. There are those, there's the series of interviews that Lester Bangs had with him, which are infamous at this point, which are actually in Lester's Psychotic Reactions and Carburetor.
Yep, I've got it. It's behind me somewhere. Yeah, that's such a great book.
I mean, talk about stuff that would not go over well nowadays.
Oh God,
they're so intense, and they're just so wrong on so many levels. But you can't stop turning the pages. I mean, they're just battling back and forth. That thing about the West Coast is kind of interesting. However,
Yeah, I wondered what you think of that, because I feel like that's a common thing where like it's not just East Coast rockers. I feel like there's this larger kind of dismissal of like the Dead and Jefferson Airplane and the whole, I mean, even the Laurel Canyon scene, they're sort of like seen as, I don't know, apart from any edge of what rock is, if that makes sense. But at the same time, like when I was growing up, like the Grateful Dead were like, I'm from Southern California, so like the Grateful Dead were like something to be feared. Like they were there was deep edge to the Grateful Dead, because when they came to our town, the town flipped out. Like it's a conservative town, and they were upset when like hundreds, thousands of hippies would show up and like do acid for 3 days in the parking lot of the fairgrounds, and take over the town essentially. So in other words, Grateful Dead was edgy to me growing up, but I wasn't aware of all these little sort of like, I don't know, political roads through rock and roll that puts Grateful Dead in a kind of other category, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they did. Well, VU and the Dead did play, I believe. They did share a bill at some point. I could be wrong about that, but I have a feeling, I feel like I have a memory of them playing maybe one of the ballrooms out west together. What's kind of funny about the phony idea, though, is that, which is, I mean, there is definitely like New York is hard, gritty, and authentic.
Mm-hmm,
and the West Coast is like head in the clouds, just kind of stumbling through the park with beads on and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the roots are not that different. I mean, VU was kind of like, I mean, there is an organic quality to how it evolved, but also there was a kind of concept about what this group would be. And we're going to put on events and soak people in lights and sound, a total environment. But then on the West Coast, they were doing the very same thing. It didn't have the bite of VU, but like the Jefferson Airplane, and there's this really early group called the Charlatans, and they were actually an art group. They were literally conceived by guys who did not know how to play instruments. And they're one of the very first acid rock bands.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the Dead. And I mean, they were both in their own ways creating environments for sound and light and like marathon scale parties, basically.
Yeah, I think like the Ken Kesey, Merry Prankster stuff. It seems like it does correspond to what the Velvet Underground were doing. It seems like there was a. And you and I had been talking about this before we recorded, Justin, this idea of like the first people to do something, right? The like, where are the people that were the first people to sort of do acid and figure out that they could like put on a show, around it and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it feels like I don't know, there were a lot of people doing that on both sides or I guess on everywhere around the United States, but like in these like certain cities where a kind of culture had been built around acid in San Francisco and in the East Village in New York City, where there were enough people that were interested in that sort of thing that you could create a sort of happening. I mean, about the Human Being in San Francisco in like 67.
Mm-hmm.
I always like talk about that in my classes as like, oh, this was like the first Coachella. Like I just like to say things like that just to like get students thinking and making connections about. But I wonder if that's even true. I mean, it can't be true. Like the idea of like a music happening, if that makes sense, rather than just like watching a performance, which is very like modernist 20th century, versus like partying and like colors and lights and a dancing and the whole experience being more than the music, if that makes sense. It seems like the 60s rockers some of them were very invested in that.
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of ideas there that were kind of feeding into it. I mean, I know that like environments in modern dance and movement were an influence on some of the bands. There was I'm going blank, but there was a theater in LA, the Theater of something. Oh, I should know it. But anyways, there was a very avant-garde theater there. Mm-hmm. And I know for a fact that was a big influence on, I know they're not hippies technically, but it was a big influence on the Doors, on the idea of creating, breaking the barrier between artist and audience. But up until, I'm trying to think like what could be considered a first happening within a rock context, I mean, it would probably have to be something in San Francisco. There was, to mention the Charlatans again, they have almost no recordings. They have like one CD, and it has like, I don't know, they did like maybe a handful of recordings in 66, 67. They did do one album later, but they had already missed the boat because they were so early. And they went out, this is quite influential, actually. They went out to, what is the name of that? Into Nevada City. Are you familiar with Nevada City?
I've never been there, but I mean, I can imagine what it's like.
Yeah, it's kind of like I think at the time, what's interesting is that it was like a Wild West resort town, like saloons and stuff.
Yep.
And they needed bands for the summer, so the Charlatans, who could barely play their instruments, were partaking in psychedelics, got booked as the summer entertainment in an actual saloon. And they brought with them psychedelic art from this guy, Bill Ham, who was one of the first light artists, the background with the bubbles and the squishy stuff that was like became a cliche with. So he built something. It wasn't quite a projection, I don't think.
The road to the lava lamp.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it was behind them, and people would go out there and the band would just play for hours. So there's that. And of course, there's the more famous, the parties down in the South Bay with Kesey and the Dead at that point. But the Charlatans one is quite interesting. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but they were the first kind of, if you ask a lot of those San Francisco musicians, who was the first band that really kind of captured it, it's this group called the Charlatans.
Looking them up. That's awesome.
Yeah, there's a documentary called something. If you just look up Charlatans and Red Dog Saloon documentary, it's not well done in a, like, you wouldn't call it a good movie, but it's kind of interesting because it has a lot of people in the movie who are kind of the bridge between the Beats and the hippies.
I love that. Yeah. That's the Diggers, right? Like this. And San Francisco. When I first started in graduate school, I didn't know any of this stuff, and I wanted to think. My sort of project that I spit out in class when I was asked on the spot to come up with something I wanted to research. In the first class in graduate school, I said, well, I want to find out the connections between like drugs and politics in the 1960s. I want to know, like, what does LSD have to do with the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement and stuff like that? And so I just had that general idea, but as I started researching, I would immediately recognize that I didn't know anything, and that there were and that a lot of the things that I thought I knew were actually, there were people doing it before them. So in other words, like that bridge you're talking about, like the Beats to the hippies. But like the Diggers in San Francisco, who are doing their stuff in like 65 and 66. And then the San Francisco Mime Troupe, who were like, they came out of like 63, 64, even before that. And they themselves, the San Francisco Mime Troupe, were part of something earlier, like called like the San Francisco Renaissance. A lot of poets who hated the Beats because they were like older. But either way, like this, when I think about the San Francisco Mime Troupe and the Diggers, they were both doing like public theater, guerrilla theater, like almost like Jackass, like, I don't know, like public pranks, but they were meant to be like scary public pranks that brought attention to like nuclear war or the Vietnam War or civil rights and things like that. I mean, they would do like reenactments of like, they have like people dressed up as soldiers and do like, shootings, the kind of thing you would never fucking get away with today. But it seems like they were all connected to that scene you're talking about in San Francisco, that becomes much, much bigger later, and people forget the Diggers and the San Francisco Mime Troupe and the groups that sort of like were really the first to think about how to bring this stuff to the public in weird ways.
Yeah, it's I love that kind of aspect, because I think the common conception is that the 60s kind of started, like, I don't know, like in the mid 60s and then went to the late 60s. Mm-hmm. But this stuff was going on. What what would be called an underground was several years earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, even the pranksters, like I love those photos of the pranksters because like when you see them on the bus, there's no beards, there's no robes. They're dressed like preppy kids. They have, they look like the Kingston Trio,
right?
But they're doing acid, and you can see as the pranksters go along, their hair is getting a little more unkempt. Like it's literally the unhinging of American youth within just a few weeks of the bus trip.
But what's also amazing about that, and this is in the Tom Wolfe, is it? Yeah, is it electric Kool-Aid acid test? He talks about how when Casey and them, when they went out in the bus initially and they started looking like what became hippies, they started looking freaky. Cops would pull them over and be confused as to what they were, and they would say, "Well, we're a theater troupe. We're a bunch of actors," and the cops would let them go because the police had no sort of visual, like cultural reference point for calling them hippies. A year later, like this is in the book, in the Wolf book, a year later, every cop in America would know what that bus was doing and what they were up to. But when Casey and them went out in, I think, 1964, it was still really square America, and you could sort of get away with it because no one knew what acid was and no one knew what hippies were yet.
Yeah, there was no frame of reference for it.
Right.
That reminds me, I'll circle back around. That just reminds me of a little detour I'll take with just the birth of rock and roll itself, or white rock, when it made the jump to white people making rock and roll, I should say. Rockabilly specifically is, it's funny with Elvis. When he first started playing, there was no uproar. Like when he was just in the South playing, he played the places that honky tonk singers would play. He played the Louisiana Hayride, and he would do his act. And there was virtually no uproar about a white guy dancing and making music like an African American. There was no scandal about it. It was just, he was another act on the bill. It wasn't until he got signed, and then to RCA, and then there was, he started to get on television, and then it would just, it mutated into this kind of national scandal. Somehow, I'm a little.
It still is. I feel like people still are just easily tossed off. Well, Elvis just stole music from black people, and that's that. Like that's the end of the story. And it seems to me like a really. It's like making a very simple story out of a very complicated one, if that makes sense. And whenever I hear that, I'm always like, well, wait a second. It feels like the kind of cultural exchange that was happening, especially in the South, was much more complex than that. Especially like, I don't know, reading about the history of blues and reading about the history of, I don't know, even like spirituals, and that kind of mixing of cultures that's happening in the South. And you talk about like the bubbling up of ideas. It seems like a much more complex picture than that. At the same time, Elvis is like the most popular, singer of the 1950s around like teenagers. And so he's connected to this hysteria about juvenile delinquents and connecting it directly to black music. So it seems like there's, I don't know, many different things going on there with Elvis.
Mm-hmm. There is. And he also liked Dean Martin.
That's right. Yeah, you know what? It's funny that Elvis, like, where is he when the 60s happened? Because I think about like when I say the 60s, I mean like, the cliche like late 60s when there's a culture war brewing that's very heavy, and you have like Frank Sinatra, more or less becoming a conservative and like and heading towards being like Nixonian. And representing kind of being revolted by the hippies and all that sort of thing. Elvis seems like he didn't. I don't know where Elvis was in all that. It seems like I'm not sure like if he really took a side on any of that stuff. Besides like heading towards, I don't know, drug addiction and cultural irrelevance, and ultimately his death at like 42 years old in what, like 1978, 79, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think Elvis was kind of a lost character. I mean, although by the end, his quote unquote comeback those records are, well, I'm going to revise that a little. Okay, so for most of the 60s, he's MIA. Like when all this amazing stuff is happening in San Francisco and LA, he's in Hollywood doing awful movies, which is,
right.
common history. But then in 68, in 69, he does his comeback special, which again, that's like a thing that, that's like a famous rock moment in rock. But, he was putting out fantastic records at that point. And he kind of had redone his sound a little. If you listen to those later 60s records, he's soaking up a lot of Southern soul music at that point, which was a very sharp move. And it's actually what the hippies were doing too. At the same time, he's actually kind of in lockstep with them musically at that point, even though he is like, there's the picture of him with Nixon by 72 or whatever.
Right.
But, Southern soul explodes in the mid to late 60s, and just about everybody's adopting elements of it. The Byrds use a lot of Southern soul on their country rock album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo. And yeah, it's just everywhere. And he's now he has his own approach to it, with horns, and he's more of a showbiz guy.
Yeah, I never picture Elvis with a cowboy hat on. As much as I think of him as sort of like, he could have gone that way. He could have done a cowboy thing if he wanted to, but I feel like, I don't know if he did. I
think he could sing just about anything.
Right.
And I think he could have, but he liked black music, and he liked Dean Martin. Literally, I say that half jokingly, like he really, I think there's like interviews where he just thought he was the next Dean Martin.
What do you mean by that? The next Dean Martin? Because Dean Martin is such a specific figure to me. Like, Dean Martin is it's funny. I love Dean Martin. I love his voice.
Martin's
I love
brilliant
his persona, everything about him. But my father-in-law has like this like Dean Martin doll. Like none of them like it. It's like none of them knows like where it came from, but like it sings, like you can and it's just this like horrifying like thing that's down in the basement that no one wants to talk about. But Dean Martin has that quality to him, and like there's sort of like a kitsch a little bit that's like not there with Sinatra. I feel like the way that Dean Martin delivers the way he sings, he's like he has a sort of, there's a sarcasm to his voice. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, Dean is super smart, and there's always a wink.
Right,
he's just a fantastic singer. But if you listen, that when you just did that deep voice, though, you went into that Dean Martin deep voice. Listen to Elvis's deep voice; it is all Dino.
It's funny. I've never made that connection before. They're not complementary figures in my mind at all. But now I want to listen more closely.
Yeah, and also on the the Sun Sessions, which are considered the legendary. Those are the first Elvis recordings.
That's the stuff I listen to the most whenever I put on Elvis.
He does. I think he does at least 3 Dean Martin songs on there.
Wow.
Yeah, ballads.
Do you know anything about his relationship to the Rat Pack? Was he a part of their thing at all? Did he know them at all? Did Sinatra hate Elvis? Do you have any idea?
They were on television together.
Yeah.
After Elvis served, they did a little schmaltzy thing, snapping fingers,
right?
And but Frank was not into rock and roll.
Right.
He thought it was kind of like just low grade entertainment.
He did some Beatles covers though, Sinatra.
He did. And yeah, exactly. And you also have to take sometimes what these people say with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because then Sinatra also said that Something was like the greatest love song ever written, and he covered it. You think he recorded like 2 or 3 versions.
I'm thinking about Elvis and Sinatra, and then in my head, I'm thinking about Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan. That were also figures that sort of like Bob Dylan sort of played with that country thing a lot too.
Mm-hmm. And the pop thing, he loved the early pop. That is an interesting thing with those guys. When you really try to break down their influences, there's a lot of contradictions there. You kind of think, okay, it's just going to be like Bob Dylan just grew up with early rock and roll or grew up with blues records. But, you know, like when you read his chronicles and stuff, he listened to lots of pop music. And I think back to my mom, actually, I think part of the confusion is that the popular history is that when rock blew up, everybody stopped listening to everything before 1956. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that, like my mom, she loved rock and roll. Listened to tons of rock and roll, but she, when she was sad, she was kind of goth when she was young. When she was sad, she'd listen to Sinatra's sad albums as a teenager. So those records were being, and Jim Morrison's
When I was 21, yeah. It was a very good year. Yeah, those ones.
And and Morrison was a huge Sinatra fan.
Jim Morrison or Van Morrison?
Jim Morrison, huge. I mean, he's a crooner. I mean, if you really like take what you think about the Doors out of it, like all the rebellion and darkness and Jim Morrison's antics, if you just listen to his voice, he's very influenced by Sinatra.
Yeah, I can hear that. Totally.
Yeah.
That's funny because I was just thinking about, like, I don't know about you, but it sounds like you were lucky enough, or maybe not lucky enough. I don't know. I don't know if it's lucky or not lucky to have hipster parents. But to sort of like be introduced to that sort of music that way, because the way I got it, and I was just thinking about this, like, when did I first hear Neil Young? When was I first aware of this? It was high school. Like, high school kids, I think since the 1960s, there's always been a contingent of high school kids that are like into Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and like 60s music. I imagine that in high schools right now in 2022, there are still groups, maybe smaller groups than ever before, that are like wearing tie-dye shirts and into like the whole psychedelic 60s, which is interesting to me because it's like stays alive decades and decades later. But that's how I got to that. And like, so in other words, the Doors, I didn't think of like the connection to Sinatra, the crooner thing. The Doors were just like what the weirdos at school were listening to, and that always had that had an edge to it. It's interesting as time goes on. I think the Doors are another group that are very like made fun of. People like really ridicule the Doors, right?
I'm a Doors defender, damn it. Yes, us Doors fans have shrunk considerably, but but you know, there's lots of good reasons.
Why is that? What happened? Why are we the minority now?
Well, I'm glad you're saying we. I'm glad we're on the same page there.
Yeah, I'm not willing to shit on the Doors. I mean, I understand it. I mean, to me, I'm not really one for like being a big like fanboy or non-fanboy about stuff. I tend to you've listened to Nostalgia Trap. We're nerds that like to talk about the nuance of everything. So like whether I don't know. To me, like the Doors are an important part of my youth, and that's a Nostalgia Trap way of putting it. Like they're something that are just connected to me because I listened to it so much when I was younger. But I understand at the same time, people that are outside of it look at Jim Morrison as like a figure of like parody. You know, they think of it as, I think so many decades go by that these figures take on almost like stereotypical cartoonish places in the culture that are very far from what they were actually like in the first place.
Yeah, the Doors it's been a long journey to cheesydom for the Doors, you know, with the movie. But what do
you think of the movie, by the way?
I saw it in the movie theater a couple times. I think if I saw it, I'd probably totally laugh. But I also kind of like, you know, I mean, I was a teenager when I saw it and I thought it was cool.
Yeah. It's a really highly entertaining movie, but the more I think about it, the more if I watched it, I think I haven't watched it in a few years. It's like, I feel like that movie is almost responsible for the cheesification of the Doors. Cause like Val Kilmer's Jim Morrison is very like spaced out, talking about the Lizard King, the whole movie. And he's kind of a cliche. I feel like you don't get to really know the real Jim Morrison in that movie.
Yeah, you know what's a lot better is that documentary that Johnny Depp narrated. This is only going to add cheese in some people's minds, but there's that documentary that came out a few years ago. Well, it might be 10 at this point. That was narrated by Johnny Depp, and they found footage of Jim Morrison's, like a film he was making in the desert, and they used snippets of it. And it's really a fantastic look at what made them so kind of revolutionary in the mid 60s, picking up some of the threads with like the ideas of like bringing underground art into pop music and what VU was doing. The Doors there was no one really like the Doors before them. Like when they come in late 66, 67, they're immediately, what's interesting is that they blow up like a pop band and they're put in there. I mean, Jim Morrison's actually on the cover of like those Teen Beat, like Tiger Beat.
Like he's a hot guy. Yeah.
Yeah. They're putting him on the cover like they would put like Frankie Avalon or something.
Totally. Yeah.
And so the Doors are like they're some of the very first cool dudes to be in a band like that. Like, they were into yoga. They were art kids. It was kind of an art kid band. They went to theater school. They went to film school. And so they're like the first art rock band, but at the same time, they're blowing up like a pop band. It's a very weird tension within the band, and I think it really helped to kind of blow them apart.
Well, yeah, and it's literary, and I feel like I don't know. That's the bridge with the Beats and the hippies. Is there's some literary thing going on as well. I mean, I try to get this with the coffee houses, but like the reading of certain like pieces of like, I don't know, poetry and certain novelists and even I don't know, figures like C. Wright Mills and like different like revolutionary academics and things like that. Knowing that stuff was almost like key to getting into, was the bridge to the music in some ways, I feel like. And yeah, they kind of popped it out, but I don't know. Part of what I feel like we're dancing around is the, why people hate the Doors is the same, is just people hate hippies. Like the hippie hatred has been like a fact of my life. I feel like throughout, I've been like a long haired dude my whole life. And like, it's sort of like a big barrier for a lot of people. And I really felt that moving to New York because there's like that East Coast, West Coast sort of thing. But, it's hard to navigate that, especially like on left-wing politics, because there's like a real divide between like the hippie libertarian anarchist wing and the sort of like or this sort of like Marxist political academics, and that was present at the Human Be-In. I mean, I think like Allen Ginsberg and Timothy Leary are sitting there like saying you need to like tune in, turn on, drop out, live a different way. Whereas these sort of like radical political dudes from Berkeley are like, we need to organize labor unions and organize like, actual structures and things like that. And it seems like they were on different pages, if that makes sense. But there's like a real, I don't know, there's also just a cultural hatred of hippies. People resent that thing. And I feel like the Doors definitely fall into that.
Which is, and the irony is that they were never hippies is the interesting thing. Like,
right.
Because if you think about like that, the second record specifically, Strange Days, which I actually think is better than the first because it's more experimental. If you listen to that second record, it is just about every character is lost, lonely, sad. I mean, it's a goth record. I mean, it's very, they loom over the development of goth. And in fact, they would be a huge influence on the Stooges, obviously. I mean, Iggy and the Stooges got signed to Elektra because Elektra was thinking they got another Doors.
Interesting. Yeah. That makes sense to me, actually, that Iggy Pop would be seen as a Jim Morrison type figure.
If you even look at the photographs of the first Stooges album to the first Doors with the bigger head, on the first Doors album, it's Morrison's big head. And then the rest of the Doors are smaller.
Right.
The first Stooges record, the cover's not that different. The heads are more even, obviously. But I mean, that you can tell by the light and quality and the layout that it was specifically marketed so that whoever flipped through and bought the Doors record would go, oh, this looks like a Doors thing. And Iggy said Doors were a big influence on.
Well, that makes sense. Like neither of these front men wear shirts often. And there's sort of like, I don't know, there's a primitivism to both of them.
Yeah, and that's where that documentary comes in. If you watch like like really good footage of the Doors live, Morrison is writhing around on the ground. Like it's kind of freakish looking what he's doing. And Iggy would just take that and basically layer himself in peanut butter and take it to another level.
Mm-hmm.
But I was going to mention about well, there's a couple things there. How do I tie them together?
Yeah, we've left many threads open here. Good, wherever you want to go, Justin.
I'll jump to two. Well, the San Francisco Berkeley thing is interesting because I kind of feel like, I mean, this could be a whole rabbit hole onto itself, but I kind of feel like that's almost like that split represents kind of just a split that haunts American radicalism. Like ever since, it's and
it's
like
social and cultural.
Yeah, I mean, I find it in myself. Like I read a lot of political radical stuff, but like when it comes to art, like when I'm on Twitter, this is going to sound snobbish, but if I start seeing a lot of leftists talking about music and art, I'll just be like, what crap are you people listening to? You're just like, what? Like, I mean, listen, Tom Morello is a great guy. But can we not talk about Tom Morello for 5 minutes when it comes to radical art and music? Like, can we maybe get into something else? Like, I don't know. I'm being very unfair.
No, dude, I totally get what you're talking about. Like, I mean, fuck, man. How many times I've mentioned 90s music and Rage Against the Machine as being like important influences on me when I was in high school, etc. And yet, looking at Tom Morello doing his like op-eds in the New York Times as sort of like the face of, I guess, radicalism in music. There's something cringy about it, but also just from what you're talking about, like, where are the other voices? Like, why is it just this one? Like, it's always like this kind of like macho guy with a guitar, and there are so many voices in like music and art that are doing interesting things about politics, or even approaching, not even being directly political. Kind of changing the focus of their music in different ways. Yeah, it flattens it out when it's just Morello. I agree with you there.
Yeah, like this is maybe utopian thinking, but I guess I kind of have always been the thought that, like, if I'm going to rewire my brain with all this incredible Marxist and Black radical writing that I like, then I'm going to want to rewire my brain with radical art and music. And I don't mean radical as in leftist art and music, but just stuff that just totally makes me think in new ways. Like to me, free jazz is such a misunderstood era, because it was such a wonderful confluence of the two. When you really read about the history of free jazz, you have like Black radical thinkers and poets mixing with Black nationalism in the form of free jazz. And I just love that there was that wonderful mixing there. And you don't see that in the white counterpart as much, I guess. Like what we were saying, like even Jerry, like there's a interesting quote where Jerry says that he was, he took acid at one of the Dead were asked to play Berkeley. And he actually kind of gives a both sides argument, which I'm like, but I get it. It's Jerry Garcia. But he says he was sitting there listening to Mario Savio. Is that how you pronounce it? He's listening to Mario Savio, and he says that he's feeling the same anger he would listening to like a speech from Hitler. Like, it's a totally ridiculous statement,
Right.
But from his perspective, it kind of, I guess, reflects the different trips that they were on. And I don't think we've been able to reconcile those trips.
Because Jerry Garcia was totally the type of person who'd be like, communism, capitalism, it's all the same game, man. You're all just playing the same game. And I feel like sometimes I can get into that point of view, and I can really, I mean, especially when I take psychedelic drugs, actually, I can like really feel that like separation from all the structures and like revulsion, like really, I mean, primitive is the right word in some ways to me. I always felt that as sort of like a remove from the whole structure of time and the whole structure of what had become industrialized time. And I get it. Like, I get why Jerry Garcia is saying, like, it's all fucking game. And on the other hand, I'm like, like you're reading a lot and you're like sort of like understanding that there is such a thing as power and there are such a thing as like, people that are different players and actors in that power game, and they can move the scenario in a number of different directions. And like, it feels powerless, in other words, to be the Jerry Garcia that's like, it's all one game. It puts you in a really kind of downer position, it feels like.
Yeah, and I think part of that, I guess, is probably a reflection of the times, right? Like a lot of these guys, Crosby, Neil Young, Jerry Garcia, I think, I think that the historical issue is that they came up of age in the 60s and they're like, man, America kind of sucks in a lot of ways. But their brains had already been so filled with anti-socialism and anti-communism that they can't go that direction either. So right. They're trapped in this. And this happens, I think this happens with a lot of American artists, like they see, they get it in their head that like socialism, communism means the death of art. But at the same time, they want to do something revolutionary and anti-establishment. And so you end up getting just a lot of like, in the hippies, there's a lot of libertarianism, which, has come up on your show time and time again.
Yeah.
It's suffused through the commune movement. It was suffused throughout Haight-Ashbury. Not exclusively, though. I should say there were some hippie houses that were actually quite socialist. We just don't hear about them as much.
Well, it's there with Neil Young too, right? Because it's like with Neil is a total unapologetic capitalist, right? Like he uses that word. Yeah, I am a capitalist. He talks about it in his memoir. Like he has all his money in properties. Or like Neil Young is a hashtag landlord, like all this awful shit. At the same time, like he's like, fuck Spotify and their misinformation. I'm out. Like he hates Spotify's business model, so he's not going to participate in it. But to me, like Spotify's decision was so obvious because they look at 6 million streams of Neil Young's music and 200 million streams of Joe Rogan's podcast, and it's that because they're capitalists, they make a simple calculation on paper, and the choice wasn't even a choice. They're going with Joe Rogan. In other words, like Neil Young's sort of like pro-capitalism perspective is sort of like undermines his attack on Spotify, because Spotify is sort of just playing the capitalist game too. I don't know. Am I wrong about that?
I don't think so. I think it reoccurs time and time again. It's like, Crosby is such a punching bag. David Crosby, I should say.
Yes.
But because Neil's cool. Neil Young's just a cool dude. David Crosby kind of bugs me. I'm maybe hard on him.
I'm with you on this entirely. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, just
David Crosby's kind of a resistance lib on on Twitter too.
He is, and then there was that funny thing about like, I think Tesla's ideas of going into space are cool, but where's my car?
Like what?
He tweeted about his car being late, the Tesla he ordered,
right.
And he was just belly aching about it on Twitter. And you're like, aren't you the dude who was at Woodstock and talking about like everybody, just the.
They showed up at Occupy Wall Street, and that was a weird moment, dude. Because I was there at Occupy Wall Street a lot. I happened to have a union job at the PSC CUNY union for the college, and that office, it happens to be right next to Zuccotti Park. So I was down at Occupy Wall Street all the time, and at some point, like all the like a procession of like boomer like 60s figures showed up to like sort of like, I don't know, it was so weird because like it's like there was no pretext that they were going to like show up and like join and be a part of it. They were just like going to like show up, take a picture with everyone, lay a flower down as if it was a dead thing already. But Crosby and them, like maybe Crosby and one maybe I think it might have been Graham Nash, I'm not sure. They showed up and they played a few songs like for the crowd, and they played like teach your children well, like that sort of stuff. And I remember watching it and being there and being like, I don't know what I think of this moment, dude. Like, this is so weird. It feels like these songs and this attitude are like incredibly dated. At the same time, it's kind of interesting to see that, like, I don't know, it's 2022 and Neil Young is like, as we speak right now, Justin, Neil Young is trending on Twitter. Everyone's talking about Spotify, Joe Rogan, Neil Young, streaming services. In other words, Neil Young and the 60s counterculture is still present in the conversation, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if we'll ever get out from underneath that shadow in some respects. It's funny, talking about that shadow looms so large, even in the stuff that rejected the 60s, was influenced by the 60s. You know, you get like something like, what would be a good, I mean, Iggy, right? I mean, there's some really funny quotes about Iggy saying that he loves that he killed the 60s with the Stooges, the Stooges as an entity. And yet, their original name was the Psychedelic Stooges. They basically laid out the blueprint for punk. And yet, like on that first record, there's like a 10-minute song where they're doing an Om chant. I mean, it doesn't get any more 60s than I think, is it called We Will Fall? If you have that first record, it's the one song that doesn't match anything else on the record,
It's funny because there was like immediate like need to like it's almost just the politics of cool and hip. I feel like it is part of this too, because there's like a need to sort of like define yourself as apart from all of that stuff, and immediately like even on like, is it like McCartney? Is it Ram that starts with too many people? Like and it's just kind of like too many people are going underground, and he's sort of like attacking like the people who are becoming new age and joining communes, and it's sort of, there's always like a sort of like need to put yourself apart from that stuff. I'm thinking about like Nirvana as well. Like by the time you get to the 90s, they were like, there's that one song where they sort of like start out with like Come Together or something like that. They're like sarcastically singing a 60s like a 60s song, and I thought when I was in high school listening to that stuff, I thought, oh, they're like kind of making fun of the 60s and sort of like attacking that stuff as like corny and lame. Yet at the same time, like one of the first times I was ever aware of Neil Young was on the MTV Video Music Awards with Pearl Jam singing Keep on Rockin' in the Free World. That was the first time I saw Neil Young really and understood him as a figure that like the 90s grunge bands were actually kind of like showing some sort of solidarity with, which was interesting. Because I'm like, am I supposed to love the 60s or hate the 60s? I'm not sure what message I'm getting from these grunge bands of the 90s, because they seem like they're kind of hippies, a lot of them. Like if you look at like Lollapalooza in 92 with Perry Farrell and all them, it's like fucking Woodstock, dude.
Yeah, I think with a lot of those guys, they in their teens, they got into hardcore and they went to Black Flag shows.
You're talking about the grunge guys.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the Seattle crowd, they got into hardcore. And then after a few years of that, smoking weed, Nirvana's a little different than this, I will say.
Yeah.
Although at the same time, I mean, one of Cobain's all-time favorite records is Aerosmith's Rocks. So Cobain's a bundle of complexities there, and what he
really appreciated pop craftsmanship too.
Yeah. And so you have like with if you look at like the Soundgarden guys and stuff, they're into punk and hardcore, and then they kind of come around, grow their hair out longer, and then start getting back into the 70s rock they were into. And a lot, I mean, Funkadelic was a huge one for them. And Sabbath and Funkadelic. I mean, two huge touchstones. But it is kind of funny, like even with Sabbath, right? There are these bands that like, a lot of it's marketing, but like Stooges, MC5, Sabbath, there are these bands that younger generations embrace in their way. Musicians will embrace them in their way of like dissing the 60s, or like if you look at punk, hardcore, and
right. I mean, those are just the outward, like that's the whole genre hates hippies.
Yeah, and then at the same time, those bands were late 60s, early 70s bands. I mean, Black Sabbath is They're long hairs, and they're singing about. I mean, they're singing about peace. They're singing actually about religion and spirituality. It's
an acid,
and a lot of acid. Yeah.
It's funny that when I think about the 90s bands, they were such a delivery system for 60s ideas in a weird way. I mean, even Neil Young, like, you can't get more of like a mythological piece of Neil Young's history in the 90s than like Kurt Cobain quoting Neil Young in his suicide note, right? Like, it's better to burn out than fade away. Like, to me, that just like nailed down this really important idea about that transmission of a spirit from like one to another. And I'm just talking mainly about just like, I realize we're talking about like a pretty narrow section of like white dude rock, but at the same time, those figures do carry beyond that, I think, in a lot of ways. They're sort of like those pop figures like Elvis. You can look at them as like people who cynically appropriated the music of others and marginalized people and took it to the stratosphere. But at the same time, another part of it for me has always been that pop is like this delivery service for marginalized ideas, and it comes through Elvis. Maybe you'll listen to Elvis and get interested in that type of music and go down that road, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think Neil played an important. I think Neil has always wanted to, in a self-conscious way, do those ideas. Because it didn't start like the grunge thing was like kind of, oh, Neil, it's that Neil Young guy, he's back. But he in the late 70s he jammed with Devo. They appear in his movie Human Highway.
I forgot about that. He had that electronic thing, like trance and all that. So those
trance,
records, yeah.
Trance is it's a wild. Yeah, trance is really wild because he was using basically the technology you would hear on a Kraftwerk album, the vocoder.
Man. Yeah, I love that stuff.
And the story behind that is pretty great too, because that was his attempt. He wanted to find a musical way to communicate to his autistic child.
Right. Yeah.
And, it's just a beautiful sentiment.
Right. Like that whole album is about that.
Yeah. And so
he's had he has put out so much shit too. Like just an unbelievably prolific artist and diverse one. Like for me, like Neil, like you never know what you're going to get. Like, all of his albums are a very different mood. Like I just picked up, Comes a Time on vinyl.
That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, just in honor of Neil and a fuck you to Spotify. I went out and bought a record. Comes a Time, which came out. I just found out it came out in October 1978, which is the month I was born. So like, oh, that's cool. And then I'm kind of reading about it last night and realizing that the album right before Comes a Time was American Stars and Bars, which I love that album, and that's like a really like I feel like that's a really druggy, like space cowboy honky tonk type album, a very like drunk album. That's the one with him like his face like crushed on the like
there's a high heel
all over. Yeah.
yeah. And he has that song.
It's amazing that's like a year apart these two records come out.
Well, and that's funny because that kind of gets back to this authenticity thing, right? Like Neil's interesting. On one hand, you could say Neil's the most authentic guy in the room, right? And yet there is a lot of David Bowie in him in a very sly way. Like when Devo came around, he put on a yellow jumpsuit. When punk got big, he refined his sound and whittled it down to Rust Never Sleeps. When grunge came around, he turned up the amps again and got insanely loud.
Was that Mirrorball? I love that record.
Yeah. And so there's a bit of like, he has a very interesting thing there where he comes off as just like, he's a dude hanging out in a barn in the redwoods, jamming with Crazy Horse. But he's a very sharp dude about kind of managing his image and what he wants to do next and where he wants to go with his sound.
he sort of like comes off as a more Bob Dylan in some ways to me, in that when you talk about him that way as that shapeshifter. Because when I think the first time I ever saw Neil Young was getting in the back of a car in high school freshman year, getting a ride from some other dude, and he had the MTV Unplugged Neil Young CD back there, and that picture of him with the like harmonica like hanging around his neck, and like to me, like that image is like there's only one other person I think of when I think of like a harmonica around the neck like that, and it's Dylan. And knowing that like Neil Young and Dylan have this sort of like, I don't know, there's inspiration, it seems like, going both ways there. But Neil Young at the same time seems like he's much more engaged in wanting to bridge to the pop world in a way that Dylan gave up on a long time ago. He doesn't give a fuck.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's just so relevant, isn't he? I think about that. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. A funny one that makes me think of that is Tonight's the Night, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Tonight's the Night's considered the most like Neil's bottomed out. People are dropping like flies around him. The music is angry and ragged and burnt out. It sounds like people are on the edge of Odin. I'm using kind of that rock critic voice.
Totally. Yep.
For that kind of fun. And yet, when you read about Tonight's the Night, it's very interesting. It was a self-conscious, it was almost a David Bowie thing. He did the Tonight's the Night tour in England primarily, and he put candelabras on the stage or something, and he came out and got behind a piano, and he was a little schmaltzy, and he was like the head of the proceedings. I mean, it was this weird.
Well, dude, now I'm thinking the 9/11 thing. Like, fuck, right after 9/11, they did this like celebrities cry on TV special, maybe 4 days later. And Neil Young sang John Lennon's Imagine, like on the piano, unaccompanied. And it was like a really intense moment, honestly. But at the same time, I'm like, look at him, like right in the center, like 9/11 happens. This dude is fucking there with his piano to sing Imagine. It just made sense to me. Like, there's a weird kind of patriotic element of Neil Young. Like, I don't know if you've heard the new album, Barn, but like that Canarican song. He's sort of like, he comes off almost like a Walt Whitman figure to me, a guy who like sings the country in some way, but also embodies some sort of down and out kind of guy, if that makes sense. I mean, the way he wears that rakish hat in the Barn documentary, I'm like, and this guy has $500 million and he wears like shitty jeans, torn up boots, a hat with holes in it, t-shirt with holes in it. It reminds me of Cobain, actually, when Justin Rogers Cooper and I, who says hello, by the way, and is a huge fan of all your posts and loves all your music knowledge and all your takes on this stuff. But, he made that point about Cobain, that Cobain, like even when he gets like rich and famous, he's sort of embodying with his clothes and with his hair, like a working class, down and out, ragged kind of person. I know it's a very calculated David Bowie type move in its own way, but it seems like Neil is like that too.
It is. I mean, I think it is. When I mention Bowie, I don't want to imply that it's just that. It's just like, because I mean, Bowie's like just so,
hyper performance.
But it's a weird interplay of authenticity and, I don't know, artifice, would you say? It's just, and the American thing too, if it he just loves America.
He does.
I think where he grew up, he grew up listening to American music, and it just hit him. Rock and roll was it. And he wanted to move to America, get out of Canada, even though he sings quite longingly about Canada on some songs. He basically went to LA and never looked back.
Yeah. I wonder, and maybe this is we can wrap up here with this last bit. Because I wanted to ask you this, Justin, about Neil Young. Sitting here, this conversation has been a lot about authenticity and all that sort of stuff. But like Neil, I feel like he has songs that are, because so much of what we've been talking about is sort of that that the politics of 60s rockers who were trying to change the world. And it feels like Neil is still that guy. Like Neil Young is still the guy that like wants to sing songs about environmentalism and things like that. I guess like there are songs of his and whole albums of his that are very direct. I mean, he does a song like albums about electric cars. Like they're so on the nose and they're so weird and they're often like the worst musically. Like they're just like shit musically. And then he does these other songs and albums that are like not directly about politics or climate change, that are just sort of about love and about nature and beauty and sort of more spaced out records. And those ones I feel like in some weird way are more politically moving for me, if that makes sense. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, like talking about politics too directly in music kind of spoils the music, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is something I was taking some notes for this. I was like totally free-form notes, but I was thinking about like the reduction of music to politics, and that's always been a sticking point with me. I'm not terribly articulate about it, but I think it's tricky. Music and art can convey politics, and I think there's some nice examples. I think a perfect example, not just Neil, would be like the American folk movement, right? The folk revival. Mm-hmm. And I mean, Phil Oakes is wonderful. Pete Seeger, these are wonderful people. They did really important stuff as activists, as singers.
Joan Baez was in there too. I feel like this is the split with Baez and Dylan. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And yet I think there's ways to communicate politics through music that is as sound.
Yeah. Not even words.
Yeah, that is very meaningful. I think for me, the one I always go back to, and there's probably people on Twitter who are sick of me talking about this, is Miles Davis's, not to jump away from Neil. I'll come back to Neil because he did some of this similarly on some of the long form pieces. Miles in the early 70s when he went electric, just to me, it's a sound, it's a collective whole, and yet each person has an individual voice. It's perfectly fair and equal in terms of working to the greater good and yet honoring individualism as well.
So like the music is embodying and modeling a kind of way of being. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And I think that that's very moving. And I personally find that more moving. I mean, I shouldn't say there are some wonderful topical songs that I was just listening
including by Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah. I mean, I saw Rage. Hey, I did stage dives to Rage Against the Machine. I mean, let's just get that on record so people don't think I'm a hater. But Neil does that. I think Neil does that with Crazy Horse, on the long epic pieces, it just,
yeah. Yep.
And he also,
dude, that last song or second to last song on Barn, Welcome Back.
Yeah.
It blew me away, dude. Every time Crazy Horse does those, when it's a song beyond 6 or 7 minutes, I know I'm in for some sort of exactly what I was saying, like a song that's not really political. But I mean, that song "Welcome Back" is sort of it kind of is. It's so subtle in its poetry, and yeah, it's spacey, and it feels like it is something that's beyond the words he's saying, but a kind of form that's kind of I don't know, utopian in its own way.
Deeply utopian, and I think what's amazing with the Crazy Horse thing is. So there's this idea of them together. They always talk about it, like the Year of the Horse, the Jim Jarmusch documentary. It's them. It's them against the world. And there's a wonderful camaraderie there where this gigantic star met up with this working band, Crazy Horse, and they're all equals working on this music, constructing something together. But then there's another layer in it that might not come across unless you see them live. And it's this beautiful way that they use feedback and distortion. It almost comes out as like this gigantic throbbing sound. It really doesn't come across on the records unless you got like a killer stereo system. And it's just this wonderful way, this wonderful example of like, what should I say, humanity or humans working together, fully integrated with technology, with the sound of electricity, making something beautiful. And that to me is like the most political thing music could do, is showing that a new reality, new form emerging out of it.
That's so well said, dude. That's a perfect place for us to end. I think I'm glad you brought up Miles, dude, because Bitches Brew. I mean, I love all of Miles Davis stuff, and I listen to all that kind of blue and all that kind of like stuff from the 50s a lot. But then in grad school, I discovered Bitches Brew for whatever reason. Maybe it was streaming music. There's another irony, is like, as much as I'm railing against streaming music allowed me to access so much shit that I'd never fucking listened to before. And Bitches Brew I listened to a lot when I was writing in graduate school, because it put me into some sort of like, I don't know, productive trance, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I love that shit, and I'm glad you put it that way, because it feels like I'd never really thought of it that way, as sort of like, I don't know, an effort in musical democracy in some ways, because Bitches Brew is just this sort of, and a lot of Miles stuff from that era feels like it is like a cacophony from a lot of different instruments and voices at once, and
musical traditions. He's using there's it's globalism. Totally. There's Indian, there's raga, there's percussion from different parts of the world. And I know someone can say, well, Miles was a tyrant, and well, I know there's the biographical stuff, but what we're talking about is the art itself. And the way it can communicate something to us. And I don't know, I think there's new realities and metaphors for how we could create a society in music. So
I love that idea. Let's talk more about that on another episode, Justin. I appreciate you coming on. It's great to finally talk to you.
Yeah, it's been a blast. Thank you.